Whispers of the ocean through narrow streets. The town was the kind where people knew each other by name, where secrets were hard to keep, but some were buried deep, festering beneath polite smiles and casual nods. Inside a dimly lit apartment on the third floor of an old brick building, a woman sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers trembling over the screen of her phone. The soft hum of the ceiling fan did little to drown out the rapid beat of her heart. She had sent the message over an hour ago. No response. Her name was Yara. 22, ambitious, and with a fire in her eyes that even life's harshest winds hadn't managed to put out. She wasn't from Belmont. She had moved here for university or a fresh start. But fresh starts didn't always go as planned. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the faint curve of her stomach. The test had confirmed what she already suspected. She was pregnant. And Kian, the man she thought she knew, the man who had once held her face with such tenderness, had gone silent the moment she told him. Across town, Kian sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The streetlight cast harsh shadows across his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw, the tension in his brows. He had seen the message. He just didn't know how to answer it. Kian had always been the kind of person who planned things down to the last detail. He wasn't impulsive, he wasn't reckless. And a baby? A baby was never part of the plan. He was only 24. He had dreams, ambitions, a future that didn't involve sleepless nights and diapers. His phone buzzed. Another message from Yara. "We need to talk. Please." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Yara was smart. She was strong. She wouldn't be easily swayed. She'd want to keep it. She'd want him to take responsibility. Kian's jaw clenched. He had worked too hard to be dragged down by this. By her. A thought, dark and unshakable, slithered into his mind. There was only one way to fix this. Yara sat across from Kian in the dimly lit cafe, her fingers wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea. She watched him, searching his face for something, anything that resembled the man she had fallen in love with. But all she saw was distance. "You still haven't said anything," she whispered. Kian leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "What do you want me to say, Yara?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it. Her grip tightened around the cup. "You don't have to say anything. I just need to know where we stand." He glanced around the cafe, avoiding her eyes. The weight of her words pressed down on him. He knew what she wanted, a promise, reassurance, but he couldn't give her that. "I'm not ready for this," he finally said. Yara let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "You think I am? You think I planned this?" Kian's jaw clenched. "We have options." A cold wave passed through her. "Options? You don't have to keep it." The words hung in the air, suffocating her. She set her cup down, her hands suddenly feeling too weak to hold it. "You're serious?" Kian didn't answer. He didn't need to. Yara pushed back her chair and stood. "I can't believe you." She walked out, leaving him alone with the storm brewing in his mind. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance. Kian ignored her calls. Yara stopped trying, but silence didn't mean the problem had disappeared. If anything, it only made things worse. Kian found himself restless, snapping at friends, losing focus at work. It was like a ticking clock had lodged itself in his skull, each second hammering in the reality he refused to face. Then one evening, Yara showed up at his apartment. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She just stood in his doorway, looking at him with tired eyes. "I'm keeping the baby," she said. His stomach twisted. "I don't expect anything from you. I just thought you should know." Then she turned to leave. Something inside him snapped. "You think you can just decide that?" His voice came out sharp, colder than he intended. Yara paused. "It's not just my decision, Kian. It's my life." His fingers curled into fists. "And what about my life? You don't get to ruin it and walk away like it doesn't matter." Yara's expression hardened. Ruin it? He knew he had gone too far, but he couldn't stop. The fear, the anger, the sheer panic, it was swallowing him whole. "You don't understand what this will do to me," he muttered. Yara's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but instead she just shook her head. "This isn't just about you," she said. Then she left. Kian slammed the door shut, his breath ragged. She was going to ruin everything. Over the next week, Kian's paranoia grew. Yara had always been independent, but now she was determined. He knew she wouldn't back down. And then he heard the news. She had told her family. His stomach churned. If they knew, it was only a matter of time before everyone did. His reputation, his future, it was slipping through his fingers. He called her that night. "We need to talk," he said. Yara sighed. "I don't think there is anything left to. Please, just one last time." A pause, then finally, "Fine." He exhaled, his hand tightening around the phone. This was his last chance to fix it. Yara sat in Kian's car, arms crossed over her stomach as the cold night air seeped in through the cracked window. The parking lot was empty, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. She had agreed to meet him, but now, sitting in the dim silence, she felt a deep unease curling in her chest. Kian's fingers drummed against the steering wheel. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was clenched tight. "I just need you to listen," he said, his voice eerily calm. Yara exhaled, weary. "I've been listening, Kian, but nothing you say is going to change my mind." He turned to her, his eyes dark. "You're ruining my life, Yara." She stiffened. "This isn't just about you." He let out a dry laugh. "You keep saying that, but it is. It is about me. You had a choice, and you made it without me." Yara shook her head. "This isn't a punishment, Kian. It's a child. And if you don't want to be a part of it, then don't." His hands gripped the wheel. His breath was coming faster now. He had spent days thinking about this, justifying it, convincing himself that there was no other way. He had tried to make her see reason. He had begged, argued, even threatened. But she wouldn't let go. She was forcing his hand. Yara sighed and reached for the door handle. "I shouldn't have come. This was a mistake." His heart pounded. "No," he whispered. She paused, her hand hovering over the handle. In that split second, Kian moved. The rope was in his pocket, coiled tightly, the fibers rough against his fingers. Before he could think, before he could hesitate, it was around her throat. Yara's eyes widened, her hands flying up as she gasped, her fingers clawing at the rope, digging into her skin. A strangled cry left her lips, but it was lost in the car's suffocating silence. Kian's arms burned as he pulled tighter, his breathing ragged. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his body didn't listen. Yara thrashed, her nails raking across his arm, drawing blood, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. Seconds stretched into eternity. Her legs kicked against the dashboard, her body convulsing as the fight drained from her. Her eyes, wild with terror, locked onto his for one final moment. Then, stillness. Kian's grip loosened. The rope slipped from his trembling hands. Yara slumped forward, her head resting against the dashboard at an unnatural angle. A ringing filled his ears. His chest heaved, his hands shaking violently as he stared at her motionless body. It was done. The realization hit like a freight train, shattering the numbness that had taken over him. He had done it. A strangled sob escaped his throat. His hands, stained with the warmth of her last moments, hovered uselessly in the air. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to listen. She was supposed to understand. But now she was gone. Kian's mind snapped into survival mode. He couldn't stay here. He had to move. His fingers fumbled with the seatbelt as he leaned over, his breath uneven. He had to get rid of her. Somewhere no one would find her. He put the car in drive, his pulse hammering as he pulled out of the lot. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, swallowing him whole. There was no turning back now. Kian drove for hours, his fingers gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. His mind raced, his thoughts fragmented. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, but no distance could free him from what he had done. Yara's body lay in the back seat, wrapped hastily in an old blanket. Every bump in the road made his stomach lurch. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting her to sit up, to scream, to tell him this was all a nightmare. But she wouldn't. His heart pounded as he reached the woods on the outskirts of town. He had been here before, years ago, on long drives to escape the pressure of his life. It was quiet, isolated. No one would find her here. He parked, killed the engine, and sat in the deafening silence. His hands shook as he stepped out, the cold air biting his skin. He opened the back door and hesitated. Her face was pale, peaceful in a way that made his chest tighten. "I didn't have a choice," he whispered. His voice sounded foreign, hollow. He dragged her from the car, every movement feeling sluggish like he was watching someone else do it. The earth was damp beneath his feet as he carried her deeper into the trees. His breath came in sharp gasps. Then he started digging. By the time he stumbled back to his car, his body was numb. His clothes were smeared with dirt, his fingers raw. He sat behind the wheel, staring blankly ahead. It was over. But the silence in the car was unbearable. It clawed at him, filled every space, every breath. He turned on the radio, but the sound of voices made his skin crawl. He shut it off and drove. When he got home, he scrubbed his hands until his skin burned. He stuffed his clothes into a garbage bag, dumped them in a bin across town, then took a long, scalding shower. But the water couldn't wash away the weight in his chest. The next morning, his phone buzzed. A text from Yara's sister. "Have you seen Yara? She didn't come home last night." Kian stared at the screen, his pulse hammering. He typed out a reply, erased it, then typed again. "Number. We talked last night, but she left." He hit send. His fingers trembled. Hours passed, then another text came. "We're worried. She's not answering her phone. If you hear from her, please let me know." Kian swallowed hard. He forced himself to go about his day, to act normal. But the walls felt like they were closing in. Every time his phone buzzed, his stomach lurched. By evening, Yara's family had filed a missing person report. Her face was plastered across social media, local news stations picking up the story. "Young woman, 5 months pregnant, disappears without a trace." The weight in Kian's chest grew heavier. He avoided eye contact with people, kept his head down. Every knock on the door made him freeze. Days passed, then a week. The police questioned him, but he had rehearsed his answers. "Yes, we spoke that night." "No, she didn't seem upset." "Yes, she said she was going home." But then came the footage. A security camera near the cafe. Yara getting into his car. She had ever been seen again. The knock on Kian's door came 10 days after Yara vanished. By then, the search efforts had intensified. Her face was everywhere, the police questioning anyone who had spoken to her in the days leading up to her disappearance. Kian had tried to keep his composure, but he knew it was only a matter of time. When he opened the door, 2 detectives stood outside. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence alone sent a jolt of fear through him. "Mr. Kian Idris?" one of them asked. His throat was dry. "Yes. We need you to come with us for further questioning." The words sent a chill through his bones. He forced a nod, pretending not to hear the pounding of his own heartbeat. At the station, the interrogation started subtly, questions he had already answered. But then they shifted, more direct, more precise. "We have surveillance footage of Yara getting into your car the night she disappeared, but there's no footage of her getting out." Kian swallowed. "She asked me for a ride. I dropped her off a few blocks from her house. She wanted to walk the rest of the way." One of the detectives leaned forward. "Kian, you were the last person to see her alive. We need the truth." His mind raced. He had been careful. He had erased any trace of her from his car. He had burned his clothes. He had covered his tracks. But then they mentioned the soil. Forensic teams had examined his car. Traces of disturbed soil, different from the city streets, had been found near the trunk. And then came the breaking point. A hiker had found the grave. The body was recovered. Yara was no longer missing. She was murdered. And Kian Idris was the prime suspect. The trial was swift. The evidence was damning. The prosecution painted a clear picture. A man desperate to escape responsibility, who saw his pregnant girlfriend as an obstacle rather than a human being. Kian's defense argued it wasn't premeditated, that he had acted in the heat of the moment, but the jury wasn't convinced. The verdict: guilty. Life in prison. No possibility of parole for at least 30 years. When the judge read the sentence, Kian didn't move. He sat motionless, his face drained of emotion, as if he had already accepted his fate long before the words were spoken. Yara's family never found peace. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring her back. Her sister still sent messages to Yara's phone, as if hoping for a reply that would never come. Her mother, once a woman full of warmth, now carried grief in every step. Her life shattered beyond repair. And the child, never given a chance to exist. The case became a national conversation. News stations debated the pressures of unwanted fatherhood, the dangers of toxic relationships, and the legal system's role in protecting women from intimate partner violence. Activists called for stronger protections, for better support systems, for more awareness about the warning signs of control and manipulation. But none of it changed the fact that Yara was gone. And Kian, once a man with his whole future ahead of him, was left with nothing but the walls of his prison cell and the weight of his own guilt. No amount of regret could undo what had been done.